The death of a world. The sky was burning, not with fire, but with radiation, an invisible poison that coiled through the clouds, turning rain into acid and the air into a silent executioner. What had once been blue skies were now a crimson haze, a suffocating dome that reminded humanity of its failure. Earth was dying, and its children were leaving. The great exodus had begun. The skies were filled with thousands of starships, each carrying the desperate, the privileged, and the chosen. The planet's orbital elevators were overwhelmed with traffic, as waves of evacuees were transported onto massive colony ships, bound for new homes among the stars. For some, it was a hopeful departure, a new beginning on planets free from Earth's collapse. For others, it was abandonment, a betrayal that left the less fortunate to perish in a world that no longer cared for them. For Elias Cross, it was a death sentence. The last shuttle. Elias gritted his teeth as he stood among thousands of people crowding the spaceport. He clutched his evacuation permit tightly, the paper crumpling in his gloved hands. His breath was heavy beneath his gas mask, the filters already clogged with dust and ash from the toxic winds that swept through the ruins of New Chicago. The boarding sirens screamed across the compound, signaling the departure of the last evacuation shuttle. His heart pounded. This was his chance. Elias pushed forward, shoving past other desperate evacuees. The ship's engines ignited, sending a tremor through the ground. The doors were still open. He could make it. A soldier in black armor stepped in front of him, raising a plasma rifle. No more civilians. The ship is at capacity. Elias froze. The words cut deeper than any bullet. He was too late. No! He surged forward, his desperation overriding logic. You don't understand. I have a permit. I'm supposed to be on that ship. The soldier's visor reflected his terrified face back at him. Not anymore. A single shove sent Elias staggering backward, landing in the dirt with the others who had been rejected. The doors sealed shut. The shuttle's thrusters ignited. And then it was gone. The last ship. The last chance. Elias sat there in the dirt, watching as humanity left him behind. The abandoned. The silence after the shuttle's departure was deafening. All around him, the ones left behind stood in stunned disbelief. Parents holding their children, elderly citizens with nowhere to go, men and women who had once built the cities now reduced to rubble. Some cried, some screamed, some simply sat down and accepted their fate. But not Elias. He refused to give up. This isn't the end, he whispered, his hands tightening into fists. It can't be. A voice spoke beside him. It is for them. Elias turned to see Nina Voss, a medic who had stayed behind to care for those too weak to evacuate. Her hazel eyes were hard, resigned, but there was still a spark of defiance buried within them. We don't have time to sit here and mourn, she said. The radiation levels are rising. If we stay exposed, we won't last the night. Elias stared at the distant ghost city, its skyline now twisted ruins beneath the toxic sky. The streets were littered with abandoned cars, shattered glass, and corpses of those who hadn't made it to the spaceport in time. They had been left to die. But he wasn't ready to die. Not yet. The new reality. The ones who had left would never look back. They had their new worlds, new homes, new futures. But Earth wasn't dead yet. Elias stood, adjusting his breathing mask, the cracked visor reflecting the ruined landscape. He looked at the survivors, the abandoned, the forgotten, and made a decision. We don't wait for death, he said. We fight for a future. Nina smirked, crossing her arms. And how do you plan to do that? Elias exhaled. I don't know yet. But he would figure it out. Because Earth wasn't gone. Not yet. And if humanity had abandoned their home, then it was up to the ones who stayed to save it. If you were one of the survivors left behind, would you fight to reclaim Earth or try to find a way off the planet? Let us know in the comments. Loving this tale of resilience and survival? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to HFY Genesis for more epic stories of human triumph. A world in ruins. The silence was worse than the destruction. Elias Cross stood on the cracked pavement of New Chicago, watching the last evacuation ships disappear beyond the sky's toxic haze. The city, once a bustling metropolis, was now a hollowed-out corpse of steel and stone. Wind howled through the skeletal remains of buildings, carrying with it the distant sound of collapsing structures and the eerie creaks of a world that had been left to die. All around him, the survivors stood in shock, watching the empty sky. The ones who had made it onto the ships were gone. There would be no rescue, no second chances. They were alone. The reality of being left behind. Elias turned, scanning the faces of the forgotten. A mother holding her daughter, her gas mask cracked but still clinging to hope. An old man, his body frail, staring blankly at the dead city. Groups of orphans, scavengers, workers, the ones who weren't considered essential. This wasn't just about survival. This was abandonment. The corporations, the governments, the ones who had built the new colonies, they had chosen who was worthy of a future. And Elias Cross wasn't on that list. Neither was Nina Voss, the medic standing beside him, her suit tattered, but her eyes still sharp. "I can't believe they actually did it," she muttered. "They just left us." Elias clenched his jaw. "We should have seen this coming. They swore they wouldn't leave people behind." He gave a bitter laugh, and we believed them. Desperation sets. And the radiation levels weren't immediately lethal, not yet, but they were rising. The sun, once a giver of life, was now a slow executioner, its rays filled with invisible death. Every breath was a risk, and every step into the open air could be one step closer to radiation poisoning. The survivors had hours before exposure became irreversible, and no plan. First, signs of chaos. Then the fighting started. It began with a single punch, a desperate man trying to steal a food ration from another. That single spark ignited a frenzy, shouts, screams, the sound of fists slamming against flesh. "Hey!" Elias roared, stepping between them before it could escalate. A man lunged at him, a factory worker, his face gaunt with desperation. Elias barely had time to react before the man's fist connected with his jaw. Pain exploded through his skull, but he stayed on his feet. "Stop!" Nina stepped forward, holding up her hands. "We have bigger problems than each other." The factory worker's chest heaved with ragged breath, his hands shaking. "We're all gonna die anyway." Elias wiped the blood from his lip. "Not if I have anything to say about it." A leader rises. Elias had spent his life fixing broken things, and right now, the people around him were the most broken thing he had ever seen. He took a step onto a shattered piece of concrete, making himself taller, making them see him. "Listen to me," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos. "We can fight each other for scraps, or we can work together to make it through this." A bitter laugh rose from the crowd. "Work together? Are you insane?" Elias met the voice with a cold stare. "Number. But if you want to survive more than a week, we need food, shelter, protection from the radiation." Silence. He had their attention now. Nina crossed her arms. "You have a plan, Cross?" He hesitated, because the truth was he didn't. Not yet. But hesitation wouldn't inspire these people. So he lied. "Yes," he said, "I do." The first steps of survival. The survivors gathered, waiting for direction. Elias's mind raced. Step 1, find shelter. The open city was a death trap. They needed an underground location, subways, bunkers, anything that shielded them from radiation. Step 2, secure food and water. The stores were already looted, but there were hidden stockpiles. He had seen them before in abandoned military convoys. Step 3, establish order. If they didn't have structure, they would turn on each other before the radiation even had a chance. "We move in groups," Elias said, Scavengers search for supplies. Defenders keep watch. Medics, he glanced at Nina, treat the ones who need help. No one spoke. Then someone nodded. Another followed. Slowly, the crowd of survivors began to organize. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The harsh truth. As the last remnants of civilization burned around them, Elias knew one thing. No one was coming for them. The people who left weren't looking back. The new colonies wouldn't spare a thought for the ones who had been deemed unworthy. Earth was theirs now, and if they wanted to live, they would have to save themselves. If you were left behind, would you try to rebuild Earth, or would you fight to find a way off the planet? Let us know in the comments. Loving this survival story? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to HFY Genesis for more epic tales of human resilience. Blast off. A world on the brink Earth was no longer a home. It was a graveyard, a planet left to decay under a sky that had turned against its own children. The wind carried ashes, radiation, and whispers of what once was. Ruined skyscrapers loomed in the distance like the skeletons of a civilization long dead. The Earth that humanity had known was gone, and Elias Cross was trapped in it. Survival in the shadow of death. The underground subway tunnels had become the last sanctuary. They weren't perfect. Nothing was anymore. The air was thick with mildew, the walls cracked and damp. But down here, the radiation levels were lower, the toxic winds couldn't reach them, and there was some semblance of safety. Elias sat near a small, flickering lantern, watching the survivors gather around for what little food they had managed to scavenge. The rations were already running low. They needed water, shelter, medicine, a plan. Most of all, they needed hope. The harsh reality. The air smelled of sweat, blood, and desperation. People huddled in groups, speaking in hushed tones. Some prayed, others planned. Many just stared at the cracked walls, waiting for death. One of the younger survivors, a boy no older than 12, sat on the cold floor, clutching a rusted can of food like it was his last connection to life. His name was Jace, and he had lost his entire family in the riots before the last shuttles left. Elias crouched down beside him. "You doing okay, kid?" Jace didn't look up. "Do you think they'll come back for us?" Elias felt a familiar pain tighten in his chest. The same question haunted every survivor here. Would they come back? Would the people who had left them behind ever return to see what they had abandoned? He could have lied, told Jace that help was coming, that the colony ships would eventually realize their mistake and return for the ones they left behind. But he had made a choice. He wouldn't give false hope. He placed a hand on Jace's shoulder. "No," he said quietly. "We're on our own now." Jace swallowed, his small fingers tightening around the can. But he didn't cry. He just nodded, accepting the reality faster than most of the adults around them. Elias hated that. No child should have to accept death like this, and he wasn't going to let them. The scavengers' gamble. They needed supplies. Now Elias pulled aside Nina Voss, the only person in this group he fully trusted. The medic's face was pale, her breaths tight. The radiation exposure was already taking a toll on all of them. "We can't stay down here forever," Elias said. Nina exhaled. "No, we can't. But if we go out there without a plan, we'll die faster." He knew she was right. The city was still crawling with threats. The dangers above. Radiation pockets. Some parts of the city had lethal levels of radiation. One wrong turn could be the end. Rogue survivors, not everyone left behind was friendly. Some would rather steal than work together. Collapsed buildings, one wrong step, and a structure could come crumbling down. But staying in the subway meant slowly starving to death. They needed to act now. "We go to the old supply depot on Wacker Drive," Elias said. "I worked there before the Exodus. There should still be military rations left." Nina raised an eyebrow. "And what if others got there first?" "Then we take what we need," Elias said coldly. Nina frowned. "We're not killers, Elias." "No, he agreed. "But we're survivors." Into the ruins. The night was quiet as they emerged from the tunnels. Too quiet. The city was a corpse, its lifeblood drained by time and disaster. Cars were overturned, buildings shattered, the streets cracked and lifeless. But something else was out here. They weren't alone. Elias gripped his makeshift weapon, a metal pipe wrapped in torn cloth, as he scanned the ruins. A shadow moved in the distance. Someone was watching them, and whoever it was, wasn't friendly. The first encounter. A voice rang out through the empty streets. "Well, well, look what we have here." Elias turned toward the voice. 3 figures stepped out from behind an abandoned truck. They were thin, their faces hollow, their clothes torn, but their eyes burned with desperation. And desperation was just as dangerous as any weapon. One of them, a man with a scar down his cheek, grinned. "You must be new to the ruins." Elias didn't move. "We don't want trouble." Scarface laughed. "That's too bad, because trouble found you." The tallest of the 3 lifted a rusted shotgun, aiming it at Elias's chest. "Drop your bags," he ordered, "and maybe we won't kill you." Elias's grip on the pipe tightened. He had 2 choices: hand over the supplies and hope they let them live, fight, and risk everything. He glanced at Nina. She gave the smallest nod. They had made their choice. Survival at any cost. Scarface took a step forward. Elias moved first. The pipe slammed into Scarface's knee, sending him crashing to the ground with a scream. Nina lunged at the one with the shotgun, driving her elbow into his throat before he could fire. The third man bolted, disappearing into the ruins. Elias grabbed the fallen shotgun and turned toward Scarface, who was groaning in pain on the pavement. He aimed the weapon. Scarface froze. "Please," he gasped. "Don't." Elias's finger hovered over the trigger. He should pull it. He should make sure this guy never came back for revenge, but he didn't. Instead, he turned the shotgun over in his hands and smashed it against the pavement, breaking it into useless scrap. Scarface's eyes widened. "You're insane." "No," Elias said, tossing the ruined weapon aside. "I'm just not like you." He turned away, motioning for Nina to follow. Scarface didn't move. He just lay there, watching them disappear into the ruins. Elias didn't know if he would come back for revenge. But if he did, they'd be ready. The fight for tomorrow. They made it back to the subway tunnels with enough food and water to last another week. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The survivors looked at them with new eyes, not as the abandoned, but as people who refused to die quietly. They weren't just stranded in this dying world. They were fighting for it. And one way or another, they would make it their home again. A discovery in the ruins. The air was thick with the smell of decay. Elias Cross tightened his gas mask, his fingers gripping the strap as he scanned the ruins ahead. The sky above was a crimson haze, the radiation twisting the clouds into an unnatural swirl. This city had once been a monument to progress and power. Now, it was a graveyard. And beneath it, there were secrets waiting to be uncovered. A hidden signal. It had started 2 nights ago. The survivors were huddled underground when a faint radio signal crackled through an old, rusted transmitter. At first, they thought it was anomalous background noise, just the death throes of a broken planet. But then, a voice, faint, distorted, alive, repeating, "Safety, coordinates." The transmission cut out, but the words burned into Elias's mind. If there was another group of survivors, or something more, out there, they needed to find it. And so, they went searching. The descent Elias, Nina, and a handful of scavengers picked their way through the crumbling streets, avoiding radiation hotspots and unstable buildings. The signal's source led them to an old government research facility, half buried beneath the remains of fallen skyscrapers. "Think it's stable enough?" Nina asked, staring at the dark, gaping hole where the entrance used to be. Elias adjusted his gear. Only one way to find out. With a final deep breath, they descended into the unknown. Beneath the ashes, the underground facility was intact, sealed away from the worst of the destruction. The air was thick with dust, the hallways lined with flickering emergency lights that barely pierced the darkness. But the strangest part, the place was still powered. Machines hummed softly in the shadows, their monitors glowing faintly with unread data. "This place is active?" Nina whispered. Elias scanned the area, heart pounding. Someone's been here. The Forgotten Project. A heavy steel door stood at the end of the corridor, rusted but locked tight. Elias pried open a nearby control panel, hacking into the old security system with shaky fingers. The door hissed open, revealing a room that hadn't been touched in decades. Inside, dozens of data servers blinked, their storage drives untouched. But what truly caught Elias's eye was the centerpiece of the room, a massive cylindrical device connected to what looked like a dormant reactor core. Nina stepped closer, her breath shallow. "What the hell is this?" Elias approached the control terminal. With a few keystrokes, the system roared to life. Screens flashed, files decrypted, and then they saw it. Project Dawn. The truth about Earth's fall. The files were detailed, too detailed, and the more Elias read, the more his hands trembled. Earth's collapse wasn't just a natural disaster. It wasn't just human negligence. It was deliberate. The radiation, the atmospheric decay, the mass exodus, planned. A controlled failure designed to force humanity into space, to leave Earth behind for good. The colonies hadn't left to escape a dying world. They had killed it. The ultimate weapon in Project Dawn. It was the contingency plan, an experimental radiation neutralizer capable of restoring the planet. If activated, it could purge the toxins from the air and make Earth habitable again. Elias's mind raced. If this worked, they could undo what had been done. They could reclaim Earth. But before he could celebrate, the terminal flashed red. Access restricted, project locked, admin clearance required. Elias's blood ran cold. This wasn't going to be easy. The weight of the truth. Elias Cross had thought he understood desperation. He had fought for scraps in a world left to die, scavenged through ruins where hope had already been buried. He had seen men and women fight like starving animals for a sip of clean water. But this was something else entirely. The truth about Earth's fall, about Project Dawn, and the deliberate destruction of their home. It had changed everything. They weren't just survivors anymore. They were the last line of defense for a planet that wasn't supposed to exist. And now, they had to make a choice. A divided camp. Back in the underground tunnels, the survivors were arguing. Elias stood at the center, facing two sides of a growing rift in their group. On one side was Jared Holt, a former security officer, his face hardened by loss. He and his followers believed that Earth was finished. "We need to find a way off this rock," Jared said, his voice firm, unyielding. "Project Dawn is a fantasy, a half-built machine left by the same people who abandoned us. You really think they left us a working miracle?" Elias clenched his fists. "It's not a fantasy. We found the facility. The reactor is there. The schematics are intact. If we can get the admin clearance." "You don't get it, do you?" Jared took a step closer, his eyes dark with exhaustion. "They wanted this planet dead. Even if that thing works, the colonies aren't just going to let us bring it back." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Elias knew the fear in their eyes. He felt it too. If they brought Earth back to life, what would stop the colonies from coming back to wipe them out again? The other side of the argument. On the other side of the tunnel, Nina Voss crossed her arms, stepping beside Elias. "We're not running," she said, her voice clear, cutting through the murmurs. "If the colonies abandoned Earth, then it belongs to us now. If we fix it, it's ours. Jared scoffed. "And what happens when the colony fleets arrive? When they send their warships to clean up their mess? We'll be ready." Nina's eyes burned with something fierce. "We're not just survivors anymore, Jared. We're the last real humans left on this planet." A long silence followed. Elias exhaled slowly. He looked at the faces around him. People who had fought for every breath, for every day in this nightmare. They deserved better. And they had to choose. The two paths forward. Elias raised a hand. "No one's being forced to stay. If you think we should leave, then leave. We won't stop you." Jared's followers looked at each other. Doubt, hesitation, fear. Elias looked back at the people standing beside him. Determination, defiance, hope. Two paths, two choices. The people who wanted to run could go. Find a way off-world, try their luck elsewhere. But for the ones who stayed, they would fight for Earth, because if humanity had abandoned their home, then the ones who remained would claim it as their own. A fateful departure. The next morning, Jared and his group left. They took supplies, weapons, even one of the few functioning vehicles. Elias stood on the crumbling highway as he watched them vanish into the toxic horizon, their destination unknown. For a moment, doubt crept in. Had they made the right choice? Had he? Nina nudged his shoulder. "They made their choice. Now we make ours." Elias looked at the ruins around him. Their home. And he made a silent promise. "We will bring Earth back, no matter what it takes." The next step, breaking into the vault. They needed the admin clearance to activate Project Dawn, and that meant breaking into the old world's most secure facility, the central government vault buried beneath the ruins of Washington, D.C. It was suicide, but survival had never been easy. Elias tightened his grip on his gear. We leave at dawn. The war for Earth's future had officially begun. Would you fight to restore Earth, or would you try to escape the planet? Let us know in the comments. Loving this battle for survival? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to HFY Genesis for more thrilling sci-fi stories. Blast off. A war no one saw coming. The moment Project Dawn was activated, the colonies noticed. They had abandoned Earth, left it to rot beneath radiation and decay. But now, they saw it fighting back, and they were not pleased. The first warning came as a single transmission from one of the orbiting colony stations. "Cease all unauthorized planetary activity. This is a direct violation of the Exodus mandate. Stand down immediately." Elias Cross read the message twice, then deleted it. They weren't standing down. The fleet returns. The first ships arrived within the week. They weren't colony transports or diplomatic envoys. They were warships. Hundreds of them, descending through the atmosphere like predatory birds returning to feast on a corpse. But this time, the corpse fought back. The defenders of Earth. Elias stood atop the old Chicago skyline, looking out over the makeshift base his people had built. Scavenged artillery, hacked defense drones, repurposed military mechs. They had turned the ruins into a fortress. The colony fleets thought Earth's survivors were a dying breed. But they were about to learn the truth. The ones who stayed, they weren't the weak ones. They were the warriors. The first attack. The colony fleet opened fire first. Plasma rounds rained down, turning old city blocks into craters of fire and ash. But the survivors had prepared. EMP charges detonated in the upper atmosphere, disrupting enemy targeting systems. Hacked satellites fired back, delivering payloads of scrap-built missiles straight into the incoming warships. The sky lit up with explosions. Earth was punching back. The ground war. As the fleet fought in the sky, drop pods slammed into the ruins, unleashing armored infantry onto the streets. The colony forces were elite, trained soldiers who had spent years in low-gravity environments. Their weapons decades ahead of what Earth's survivors had scavenged. But they had never fought on this battlefield. They had never fought people who had bled, starved, and suffered just to live another day. And that mistake cost them everything. The cost of survival. The streets turned into a war zone. Survivors fought with anything they had: rifles, grenades, makeshift explosives. They lured colony squads into booby-trapped buildings, turned every alley into an ambush site. And when the colony forces realized they were losing, they made their choice. They bombed the cities. They tried to erase the survivors. They thought if they burned what was left of Earth, they could kill the resistance. But fire only makes steel stronger. Project Dawn. Humanity's last hope. In the middle of the chaos, Nina Voss was racing against time. The colony fleet was desperate, throwing everything they had at stopping Project Dawn. If it activated, Earth would heal. And if Earth healed, the colonies would lose their excuse for leaving. They couldn't let that happen. Elias fought his way through the ruins, blasting through enemy soldiers to reach Nina's team at the Dawn facility. "We have to activate it, now!" he yelled, diving behind cover as plasma fire rained down. "We need more time," Nina shouted back. "The system isn't fully online." "Then we do it manually." The final stand. Elias charged into the reactor room, slamming the final override switch. A deep rumble shook the ground. The entire facility roared to life. Above them, the sky changed. A massive pulse of energy erupted from the Dawn facility, spreading across the atmosphere, pushing back the radiation, the poison, the death. And as the clouds parted, revealing a sky that was finally blue again, the colony fleet hesitated. For the first time, they understood. They hadn't been fighting the past. They had been fighting the future, and they had lost. The Dreet, the surviving warships, fled back to orbit, the realization sinking in. Earth was alive again, and it belonged to those who had fought for it. Elias stood amidst the ruins, his body covered in dirt, blood, and sweat. He looked up, watching as the last colony warship vanished beyond the clouds. They would be back. But next time, Earth wouldn't be waiting. Earth would be ready. If you were in Elias's shoes, would you have fought for Earth or tried to negotiate with the colonies? Let us know in the comments. Loving this battle for humanity's future? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to HFY Genesis for more epic sci-fi stories. Blast off. The aftermath of war silence. For the first time in years, there was silence. No more gunfire, no more distant explosions, no more warships darkening the sky. The battle was over. The colony fleets had retreated, their war machines beaten back by the very people they had abandoned. And Earth was alive again. Elias Cross stood atop the shattered remains of what had once been a skyscraper, watching as the dawn broke across the new world. The sky, once choked with radiation and ash, was clear, a soft, pale blue, streaked with wisps of gold. The air, once thick with poison, was cleaner, tinged with the scent of wet earth and hope. Behind him, survivors emerged from the ruins, stepping into a world they had refused to surrender. And as the sunlight warmed his skin for the first time in years, Elias smiled. A world to rebuild. They had fought for this moment. They had bled, starved, and suffered for it. And now, it was time to rebuild. The survivors, once scattered and desperate, had become a people again. Nina Voss stood beside Elias, scanning the ruins of New Chicago, her eyes calculating. "First priority is clean water," she said. "We have underground wells that are mostly intact, but we need a filtration system before anyone gets sick." Elias nodded. "What about power?" She exhaled. "The Dawn facility's core is still operational, but we'll need to set up smaller grids in different sectors. We can start with solar panels from the old cities." Elias looked around at the makeshift camps, the people pulling scrap together, the children peeking out from behind crumbling walls, finally seeing a world that wasn't dying. He turned to Nina. "We're not just surviving anymore." She nodded. "We're living." The colonies won't forget, but they weren't safe yet. The colony fleets had retreated, yes, but not because they had given up. They had underestimated the survivors, and the next time they returned, they would come prepared. Elias knew the truth. The colonies couldn't afford to let Earth rise again. If humanity realized that the planet they had been told was dead was actually thriving, the fragile order of the outer worlds would collapse, and the people who had been born among the stars would start looking homeward again. That was the real threat. Earth wasn't just a planet anymore. It was a symbol, a rebellion waiting to spread, a warning from the stars. A single transmission came through an old, repaired satellite from High Command. This is your final warning. Cease planetary development immediately. Failure to comply will be considered an act of war. Elias laughed. War? What did they think had just happened? He walked to the radio, pressed the transmit button, and spoke 7 words that would change the course of history. Earth belongs to the ones who stayed. He cut the transmission. No begging, no negotiations, no fear. Let them come. Earth had already been through hell. And this time, they were ready. The future of Earth. The survivors weren't just survivors anymore. They were the first citizens of a new world, the first true heirs of Earth. And when the colonies returned, they wouldn't just be fighting for scraps of a dying planet. They would be fighting for a home that refused to be forgotten, a home that had already beaten them once. Elias Cross turned to his people. Today, we stop surviving. The survivors stared at him, their faces tired but unbroken. Today, we start living. A roar of voices filled the air, echoing across the ruins. They had won the first battle. Now, they were going to win the future. If the colonies returned with an even larger force, should Earth survivors fight back again, or should they try to strike a deal? Let us know in the comments. Enjoyed this epic journey? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to HFY Genesis for more stories of human resilience. Blast off.